Now before we dive into the language, let's take a moment to look at JavaScript data types. Now every programming language usually have a set of data types. The data types of a programming language are types of data the programming language can work with. Now JavaScript has quite a few different data types. Let's take a look at them. First we have strings. Now strings in JavaScript are used to represent plain old text. And they're also one of the primitive values in JavaScript. Then we have numbers. In JavaScript we have only one type of number, which is used to represent both integers and floating point numbers. And numbers is also one of the primitive data types of JavaScript. Then we have booleans. Now booleans, unlike strings and numbers, can only take one of two values, true or false. And this is also a primitive data type in JavaScript. Then we have symbols. Symbols are a new data type added to the language on the release of ECMAScript 2015. And then we have objects. As you learned that almost everything in JavaScript is actually an object. And inside objects we have all different types of objects. We have some built-in objects such as arrays, dates, and functions, and we also have custom objects that we can define ourselves. And then we have a special value called null. Now null means a deliberate non-value, which means the value is non-existent. And another special value we have is undefined, which represents a value that is not defined yet, which means the value is undefined now, but the value may be defined later. So these are the main data types of the JavaScript programming language. Now let's talk about what JavaScript can actually do. Like, we know JavaScript is a programming language, but what power does it actually hold? What can it be used for? And what things can it accomplish? Well, JavaScript, being a programming language, can do a lot of things. But right now, let's take a look at some key things JavaScript is capable of doing. First of all, JavaScript can add, change, or delete HTML. So when used inside the browser, JavaScript can manipulate HTML to a high degree, and this can be used to build dynamic and interactive web applications. Now remember the JavaScript code that we saw in our greeting application? In that application, we used JavaScript to manipulate HTML, so that's one of the key things JavaScript can do. JavaScript can also add, change, or delete CSS styles. Now we didn't actually do this in our example greeting application, but just like HTML, JavaScript can actually manipulate CSS styles as well. JavaScript can react to certain events. So inside a web application, for example, there are usually a lot of events that can happen. For example, the user is clicking on something, dragging something, inputting something, copying or pasting something, or pressing a key on the keyboard, or maybe something like a resource is being loaded or has finished loading. These are all events JavaScript can react to. So when these events occur inside our web application, JavaScript can actually react to it and run some code in response to these events. We actually saw an example of this in our greeting application, where when the user clicked on the Say Hi button, we ran some code. Specifically, we ran some code which greeted the users by their names. So this is how JavaScript can react to certain events inside a web page. JavaScript can add dynamic logic and behavior. Now we actually saw a little glimpse of this feature inside our application, where we use the logical OR operator to find out whether the user has actually inputted something valid in the input field, and if it has, we use that input. Otherwise, if there's nothing valid inputted on the input field, we just default to the string world. So that is a cool little example of how JavaScript can be used to add dynamic logic and behavior to your code. JavaScript can create interactive web applications as well. So with our greeting application, for example, we created a very simple yet interactive web application where the user can actually input something, click on buttons, and receive feedback for their actions. And this is how you can create interactive web applications using JavaScript. And JavaScript can also communicate with and even run on the server. Now that's also one of the more important things that JavaScript can do. JavaScript can communicate with the server. For example, it can send JSON data to the server using AJAX requests, and this can be used to build single-page interactive web applications using JavaScript. And with runtime environments such as Node.js, JavaScript can actually run on the server as well, which means JavaScript can actually be used as a server-side scripting languages on the server itself as well. Now let's talk about some facts about JavaScript. But these are some cool things that you should know about the language. First, JavaScript is considered the programming language of the web. Now, JavaScript is massively popular in front-end and client-side web applications. Almost every browser supports JavaScript, and JavaScript is used in almost every dynamic web page or web application. And that's how it has gained massive popularity and has become the default and go-to programming language of the web. JavaScript and Java are actually separate programming languages. So despite the similarity in the name, these two are actually separate programming languages. They are not the same. JavaScript is actually inspired from Java, and that's why JavaScript's syntax is actually very similar to that of Java's. However, these two are fundamentally separate programming languages. Java is a class-based compiled programming language supporting strong static typing, whereas JavaScript is a prototype-based lightweight scripting language with dynamic weak typing. So while there are similarities between the two languages, these two are actually separate programming languages and they are not the same. Almost everything in JavaScript is an object. Now, you might not understand this right now, but as we go through this course and start learning about JavaScript more and more, we will understand that almost everything in JavaScript is actually an object. Objects are the fundamental building blocks of JavaScript, and that's why objects are very, very important when it comes to the JavaScript programming language. Now, JavaScript is actually officially called ECMA script, and it's a standard maintained by ECMA International or ECMA International. So the official name of JavaScript is actually ECMA script. JavaScript was actually first designed by Brendan Eich in 1995, so you can think of him as the founder of this language. And the latest stable version of JavaScript is called ECMA Script 2017, which, as the name implies, has been released in 2017, and that is the latest stable version of JavaScript. And just like with every stable release, quite a few new features have been added to the language in this release. Now let's take a moment to talk about how JavaScript is actually executed inside the browser. Now, JavaScript code is executed from top to bottom, left to right. So the JavaScript interpreter starts the execution at the very top of the code, starting from the first line, and then it continues executing the code line by line. And for each line, the code is executed from left to right. So for each line, the execution starts from left and goes on towards the right. JavaScript is case sensitive, and this is a very important thing to remember because most of the time when writing code, the case matters. So a lowercase letter is not necessarily the same as the uppercase letter. And because the JavaScript language is case sensitive, that means most of the time you'll have to write the JavaScript code as is. You can't change the case, otherwise the code might not work. So if you see some example code in this course and decide to try it out yourself, then make sure that you write the JavaScript code exactly as is. Because most of the time, if you change the case a little bit, or the case is not right, then the code will throw an error and the code won't work. So that's why you have to be very careful when writing JavaScript code, because most things in JavaScript is case sensitive. JavaScript statements are actually commands that are executed by the browser or the interpreter. So in JavaScript, you can think of each statement as a different command, or instructions that tells the browser to do something. JavaScript statements should end with a semicolon. Now in some cases you might be able to skip this and the code might still work. However, as good practice, you should always end a statement with a semicolon. This makes the code more readable and manageable. And inside a browser, when JavaScript is executed, it is actually executed along with HTML and CSS in an execution environment called a browser tab. So when you open up a web page, you usually do that in a tab inside the browser. And this browser tab is the execution environment for the JavaScript code. And this is where the JavaScript code is actually executed.